discussing today's topics from an African American perspective. This is Another View.
Happy Friday, everyone, and welcome to Another View. I'm Barbara Hamm Lee. Want to say a very special thank you to all of you who made your pledge of support to Another View and WHRV last week. We surpassed our goal and then some. So thank you so very, very much for believing in us and supporting us, not only with your listenership, but also with your dollars. And also a very special thank you to the Girl Scouts of the Colonial Coast. I, along with 6 other fabulous women yesterday, were honored as Girl Scout famous formers, meaning we used to be Girl Scouts, meaning we used to be Girl Scouts, and we were all honored together. So thank you so very, very much for that. Today we have something new on Another View. It's called the Claville Report, Policy, Law, and Politics. And we'll tell you all about it in just a few minutes. But first, we welcome Gayleen Knoyton with Celebrate Healthcare to remind us it's time to enroll for our healthcare benefits. Hi, Gayleen. How you doing?
Hi, Barbara. Thank you for having me today.
Not a problem. So it's time. The enrollment starts November 1st. Is that correct?
That's correct. November 1st to January 31st.
Okay. Anything new? What's new that we need to know?
Well, basically, you just need to apply early and not wait to the last minute. That's the most important. That's the most important thing. But also, people need to realize that, if you don't have insurance, there is a penalty, and you could pay $695 or 2.5% of your income, whichever is more. And so that's real important that everyone get coverage. And it's important to have coverage because it helps protect your health and your wallet.
Absolutely. How is Virginia doing in terms of enrollment?
Oh, Virginia's doing very well in terms of enrollment. The governor is behind our plans, is behind the Affordable Care Plan, and we have additional resources in Virginia that's helping us now.
Okay. So you all are assisting to help folks enroll. I know you have something going on Saturday, November the 7th on the peninsula.
Yeah, correct. This is our 3rd year where we have our series of Enroll Fest during the enrollment period, and we travel all over Hampton Roads and the Richmond area. So this Saturday, November the 7th, from 10 a.m. to 1 p.m., we will be at Boo Williams Sportsplex at 5 Armstead Point Parkway from 10 to 1. And Joanne Grossi with Healthy Human Services will be here as well. And we will give away free flu shots. The Hampton Health Department will do that. We'll have personal assisters to help people to enroll in a plan. We'll also do affordable care plan training. We'll have health screenings. We'll have an exercise class.
Oh, wow.
And then we'll have a mini job fair along with Everest College will be there to talk about classes that you need to take to be certified for some of these jobs to be coming out that are in dire need of folks in the healthcare arena. Mm-hmm. And after that, November the 14th will be at St. Paul's Church in Suffolk from 10 to 1. And then on Monday, November 16th, we'll be at Green Run High School from 6 to 8 p.m. But Boo Williams, we're going to kick that off this next Saturday, November the 7th from 10 to 1.
Okay.
And we're really looking forward to having everyone come out and learn. And guess what? We're going to be launching a new game called HealthyWinnings.com, where people can learn about health and earn prizes, too.
Oh, that's fantastic. So where can people go to find out more information?
They could go to CelebrateHealthcare.net. You can like us on Facebook at Celebrate Healthcare, or you can call 757-287-0277. That's 757-287-0277.
Okay, Gayleen Knoyton with CelebrateHealthcare.net. Don't forget that it's time for you to register for your insurance. Thank you, Gayleen, so much. We appreciate you.
Thank you so much.
All right,
okay, bye-bye.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. So Marian Wright Edelman, the former founder of the Children's Defense Fund, had this to say about voting. People who don't vote have no line of credit with people who are elected and thus pose no threat to those who act against our interest. And according to Carter G. Woodson, quote, in our so-called democracy, we are accustomed to give the majority what they want rather than educate them to understand what is best for them. Voting is more crucial than ever before, but it is critical that voters be educated on the issues and the candidates. That's why we've started something new on Another View. It's called the Claville Report, Policy, Law, and Politics, and it's the brainchild of Assistant Professor and Director of the Hampton University Pre-Law Institute, Eric Claville. Hi, Eric. How are you?
Hi, Barbara. Thank you for having me.
Oh, we are so excited to do this. So Eric is serving as my co-host during this time, and joining us by phone is Spencer Overton, Professor of Law and President of the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies at the George Washington School of Law. How are you, Spencer? So glad to have you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. So let me talk to you first, Eric. Why did you come up with this idea, and why is it important, particularly for people of color?
Sure. Well, one thing I like to say is that when my wife and I were transplants here to the Hampton Roads area, but when we arrived, I mean, we absolutely fell in love with it. The boys love the area. And I tell everyone, Hampton Roads is a place where I can do everything I love. There's history here. America started here in Hampton Roads. Mm-hmm. There's also great politics here. There's an important election every year in the state of Virginia. And, of course, we know Virginia helps to dictate what happens in Washington. As a matter of fact, Northern Virginia is known as the suburbs of D.C., right? Not only that, but there's also a lot of other issues, and we have a great area. But one thing that I noticed is that there wasn't really a show or anything dedicated to educating the public about public policy and law and politics and how it affects your everyday lives. For myself, I fell in love with law when I was 8 years old. I knew that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to be a lawyer. Okay, that's all I've ever wanted to do in life. Along the way, I also fell in love with politics. And then as I majored in political science and started working as an undergraduate student for an elected official, running a downtown office and a district office and attending meetings at 19, 20 years old.
You really got immersed.
Yeah, I really got immersed. I really didn't know what I was really being exposed to. But later on, of course, working with the state legislature and so forth, I started to see how it all came together and really how politics and policy dictates everything that we do in life. As a matter of fact, in understanding that and also teaching public policy, constitutional law, civil rights, and the like, I created this theory that I believe that every law and piece of public policy fits in. So I believe that all laws and public policy, whether it be case law or laws passed by statutes and the like, are created for three reasons. Number one, to control and dictate beliefs, behavior, and resources. In addition, if you look at the pendulum of justice, I also, in teaching constitutional law, I tell my students, the pendulum of justice swings to the extremes. If you ever swing a pendulum, you notice that it goes to the extreme left and all the way back. But, of course, there are other forces in physics that causes that pendulum to swing. But as it relates to public policy and case law, I believe that, of course, the pendulum of justice swings to the extremes, but there are social, political, economic, and other forces that influences that pendulum to swing back and forth. Case in point. So let's test those two ideas, those two theories.
And we need to bring Spencer into this conversation pretty quickly too. But hang on, Spencer, we're coming to you.
We're great.
About 30 seconds. If you look at the Brown versus Board of Education 2, 1954, the morning before Brown 2 decision came down, there was legalized segregation of schools. The day afterwards, the court ruled no more legalized segregation of schools, now integration. So now you see that pendulum swing from one extreme to the other. But now you have social forces that's pulling that pendulum back and forth to determine how fast, with all deliberate speed, do we integrate schools. So now, pre-Brown, you had the beliefs of the country believing that African Americans should receive less, white Americans should receive better, and white Americans cannot go to school with black Americans and the like. Again, to control beliefs, to control resources. And, so therefore you have funding going to certain schools and less funding going to other schools. And then behavior. You can't go here. You can't do that. So you're restricting. So I also tell individuals, when you ask, why don't people do this or why don't people do that, go back to the public policy. One very interesting part is about swimming. People ask the question, why don't African Americans swim? Well, look at public policy. African Americans were not allowed to go to public pools. So therefore, why learn to swim? You didn't need to.
Very good point. So I'm going to let you start the conversation with Spencer in terms of why is it so critical for us to start voting? How does that affect, our daily lives?
Sure. Spencer, how are you?
I'm doing well. So great to hear your voice.
Same here, my good friend. Same here. Well, one thing I want you to discuss with us today, Spencer, is, of course, with your expertise being president of the Joint Center for Political Economic Studies, we're looking at not only, why law and public policy is created, but why it's important. With that being the case, we understand that politics is the who of gets what, when, where, and how. The how is through public policy. The influence of that is through special interest in voting. So with that being the case, how does politics and public policy affect the economic impact, especially on communities of color?
Right. Well, thanks again for having me on,
Sure.
Eric and Barbara. Appreciate it immensely.
Mm-hmm.
And, I think a place that we can look at in a very concrete way would be Ferguson, Missouri, right?
Mm-hmm.
So in Ferguson, Missouri, we have a situation in 2012 where we've got, it's a majority African-American community, but we've got a situation where whites and African-Americans are voting at about the same level in national elections in 2012. But just a few months later, in local elections, whites are 3 times more likely to vote than African-Americans. And so we shouldn't be surprised that a city council that was then almost all white, it only had 1 African-American member. And so you got a predominantly African-American town, and because of the low turnout in these local elections, we've got a city council that does not reflect the populace. And it's not just skin color, because it's not about skin color. It's really about the priorities and the policies and the issues of the community as a whole. So when we talk about how the municipality raises funds, you remember that they were raising a lot of money through court fines and fees and through tickets and other things that really have a harsh impact on poor folks. And they were really enforcing the law in a way that was frankly discriminatory in terms of, at least that's what the Justice Department found. And it's not just criminal justice issues. I mean, when we talk about education, when we talk about economic development issues, there are so many issues that impact communities of color in different ways. And if we're not voting, those who are elected on the local level, state level, national level, are really not focused on the interests of communities of color, including African Americans.
Spencer, let me ask you this then. But so, first of all politics are local, as you know, and people really need to understand that. But the question is then, with so many negative ads and the way that politicians politic, how do you get to the issues? I mean, what do you tell people to do in terms of how they can figure out Ferguson as an example? What candidate would try to help prevent, using those traffic tickets in the way that they were used as an example?
So Barbara, I think we've got to kind of separate the horse race in terms of the candidates who have incentives to run ads and do whatever they can to make it first across the line, from communities, and communities in terms of block club captains and other folks who are actively working to get people out to the polls and point them in the direction of the right candidates, And so I think that as a community, we can't just rely on candidates. We can't rely on political parties. I mean, one of the reasons that we see that, African-American turnout is 54% in the presidential election in Ferguson and only 6% in these municipal elections is the municipal elections are nonpartisan. And so you don't have political parties that are investing money in heavy, in black turnout because they don't have the incentives. They're not there. And so if you're solely relying on whether it's political parties or candidates, to move voters as though voters are just a tool of campaigning to mobilize to a poll. That's not democracy. So I think we really need to have communities, leaders within communities, block clubs, citizen action groups, etc., mobilizing, educating, engaging voters on, as you said, all politics is local. We're so focused on this national thing and what's on the Rachel Maddow show or the Fox show and the Republican versus Democratic stuff. So many of these issues that impact our communities are decided on the local level, and it's the easiest way for folks to get engaged and participate.
440-2665 or 1-800-940-2240 are the numbers to call to join our conversation. Are you actively involved in politics, in helping to get the vote out? Give us a call and tell us what you're hearing on the ground. 440-2665 or 1-800-940-2240. Eric?
Spencer, you mentioned priorities and why some communities, mostly communities of color, are not engaged at a high rate when there's a non-presidential election. As it relates to party, actually here in the state of Virginia, one study came out this morning that I've heard that the voter turnout is going to be around 30%, and that your mostly white, older, suburban voters are going to vote at a higher rate than others. And I believe that falls squarely on the shoulders of economic priorities and how that group benefits from the public policy that's passed by these legislators. Can you kind of elaborate or discuss, first of all, if you agree with me and if there are any other factors that you think impacts that?
Right, but see, I would say, Eric, that just as though those people who vote benefit from those economic policies, that those people who don't vote are disadvantaged and have just as much at stake in terms of participation. I would say that, perhaps there are some socioeconomic factors in terms of why people from particular communities tend to vote a little bit more. But I think that those socioeconomic issues can be overcome through real engagement and organization. I mean, we've got a political party, the Democratic Party, that invests a lot of resources every 4 years to get black folks out to the polls. And so it can be done. The question is, can we pull together some resources? And if they're not financial resources, or there's some things we can use like social media and some other tools and churches in order to mobilize the vote in these off-year elections. 93% of local elections across the country are held at a different time than the presidential election. And what that means is for a lot of these local races, black turnout is incredibly low, and it's disproportionately low relative to the participation of whites. And so, we really want a situation where everyone is participating and everyone is engaging. I certainly don't mean to suggest that I'm talking about disenfranchising or excluding anyone. I really think increased participation by African Americans in particular in these local elections and in the off-year elections and the primary elections is essential. So, we can have a, political science, empirical debate. Why does this happen? And to a certain extent, that's important so that we can figure out how to change it. So, I think that it is incredibly important. But what I would say is, as opposed to us observing that and figuring that that's just kind of structural racism or something that's not penetrable, I think that we've got to figure out some real tools so that we can stimulate, so that we can motivate. Part of it is public education through radio shows like this one. This is incredibly valuable and incredibly important. And there's some other things that we really need to do to, engage folks and just get them to the polls.
You mentioned two very important points. I want to take a look at the importance of local elections, but also with voting. Now, I had a conversation with a friend of mine who is an elected official, and we talked about, the majority of state legislators really not being challenged in their districts, okay? Now, we could talk about gerrymandering, we could talk about drawing a district lines. However, are you of the belief that every elected officials should be vigorously challenged through every election and held accountable for the votes that they cast. And with that, how important is that as it relates to the local elections and the state policies that are passed?
I think that certainly competition is important. I think that it's likely more of an issue on the state level and in the U.S. House of Representatives in the way that these districts are drawn. To a certain extent, it can be have an impact on local elections, but turnout is so low on local elections. In local elections, if you can increase turnout from 20% to 40%, no matter, often on these local elections, no matter how the lines are drawn, you could drastically change the outcome. So I agree that sometimes it's a situation where, it's kind of fixed, where the politicians are selecting the voters rather than the voters are selecting the politicians, right? Sometimes that's the case, especially in these state legislative elections. So, that's the case. But in these local elections, turnout is so low that it's not really about can we get more people registered or, hey, can we redraw the districts? Often it's about can we increase voter turnout from 20% up to 30%, and that additional 10% of new voters could swing and determine election and just really completely change the outcome.
So how do you get rid of the malaise, though, and the attitude of, well, there's only one person running in my district and they're going to win anyway, so, I don't have time. Why should I even bother? How do we get past that so that people understand, why it's still critical to hold their feet to the fire, whether they're, running unopposed or not?
Right. Very honestly, I think that a lot of this is about personal relationships. A reason that people vote is because someone asked them to, and often it's someone that they know. If the person is someone that they know, they're more likely to participate. And so when we talk about increasing turnout from 20% to 30%, that's not a huge number. So as opposed to saying, hey, general person, don't you know that if you just go out and vote, we could, kind of change this thing, and here's the connection between the policy and your life and the fact that you don't vote. I think that's fine, but I think another way to do this is to basically recognize there are some community leaders who are already out there, who have a lot of influence, who are, connectors, as Malcolm Gladwell might say. So these folks who might be pastors, maybe they run community groups, maybe they provide services to returning offenders and this kind of thing. So just maybe they're connected in the community, queuing into those folks and say, hey, during this week or two, let's really get together and focus on, mobilizing folks to the polls and identifying who we can get who usually is not voting in these local elections and really target folks to get them out to the polls. And again, that uptick from 20% to, you all know these local elections are sometimes determined by 200 votes, 250 votes. It's a small number of votes, right? And so if these local leaders can kind of get together and get out an additional 300, 400, 500 votes, that could change everything. So, you identify 50 people who are connectors, and, they are able to each mobilize 20, 25, 30 people. It's a game changer. And at the very least, politicians are paying attention and they're responsive to the policy interests of those communities. So even if they don't lose, and the objective is not to defeat all incumbents, right? The objective is to get incumbent elected officials and challengers to really hone in on the interests of the communities as opposed to one particular special interest or another, or this developer or that developer. We want them to really represent the community as a whole. And so that's the goal. And that type of voter mobilization a program, I think, actually is feasible, and I think it actually works and makes a big difference.
If you're just joining us, we're talking about politics and policy with Eric Claville with Hampton University and Spencer Overton with the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies at the George Washington School of Law. Let's take a phone call, Eric.
Sure,
What do you think?
sure.
Brad joins us from Virginia Beach. Hi, Brad. You're on the air.
Hi, thank you for having me. How are you doing?
Okay.
Well, when I heard you say you wanted somebody to call in and give a little bit of input as far as what opinions throughout the voter base has been, I personally serve in the Marine Corps. I work with a lot of other military members in a few different branches at the duty station I'm at. And, of course, we've talked about the upcoming elections and politics in general, and you hear a lot of service members, which is rather disappointing to me to hear, that say that they don't plan on voting. And when you ask them, why you're serving the federal government directly, feels like you should have pretty strong opinion on this, and they just simply say that they don't have much faith in any politician.
Wow.
Considering unnecessary or I should say ill thought out budget cuts. Priorities weren't taken into consideration, as well as when service members contact their representatives, their congressmen, or even senators, they oftentimes complain that their questions or comments or concerns are completely unheard, and they don't get anything back. So they've lost a lot of faith in those people, and you ask them, well, shouldn't you put somebody or help put somebody into a position that you do trust? And at that point they say, well, it's very hard for me to vote. The military hasn't given me too much as far as options of voting. And I don't necessarily think that's completely true, but I do slightly see where they're coming from. They oftentimes put a lot of options in front of us as far as, this is how you get car insurance, this is how you do this is how you do that, a lot of educational programs about that. And they do tell you about absentee ballot voting and that it's coming up, but they really don't push the education on how to go through with that. So a lot of service members just don't do it unless they happen to be serving in their local areas.
Absolutely. Brad, you bring up several very good points.
Yeah.
So, Eric, I'm going to let you take it from there. Thanks for calling, Brad. We appreciate it.
Sure. So Brad brings up a point that individuals, when they do call and complain or give their concerns, that they're not heard. So the voters are saying we're not going to vote. And that's really keeping the problem in. I mean, it's not solving the problem. It's making the problem worse. One thing about our country, what makes it so great is the one man, one vote. Okay. So basically an elected official, when I talk with them and consult, I say, there are 3 rules to politics. Number 1, when you're running, number 1, get elected. Number 2, stay elected. Number 3, get reelected. Everything else is in between, right? Because unless you're an elected official, you have no power. So with that being the case, I think if you look at a case study, what happened with Eric Cantor in Richmond, okay, he wasn't being responsive to his voting base. His voting base spoke up by electing someone else. I mean, no one saw that.
And they really
coming.
shocked everybody. Yeah.
Oh, tremendously. I mean, he really should be the next Speaker of the House right now. But due to him being voted out, he's not. So with that being the case, I think that educating the public on why the local laws and the local elections are important to their everyday lives, Spencer, I think that's the greatest challenge. I mean, I remember sitting in finance city council meetings and so forth. That's some very hard stuff to really sit through for a couple of hours. But contracts are being awarded. Ordinances are being passed and so forth, also on the state level. So how do we get the public to be engaged and say that, hey, even though you're working here and you're going here, this city council meeting is important. You need to be here, or you need to at least review the agenda and the minutes online to hold your elected official accountable. How do we do that?
Right. Well, I think that it's difficult for us to kind of immediately, I don't know that we have the resources to immediately say, hey, we're going to get every single person involved here. We'd like that to happen, but I think that logistically we have finite resources. I think we can say, though, let's get 20, 25, 30 people from our community involved. Hey, these other folks, they're trustees at the church, but your job is to show up at city council meetings and pay attention and to give us a report back at church,
that's a great
whatever,
idea.
right? So that there's some designated people who are really tasked with paying attention and being active and reporting back to the community as a whole, so that we really do have visibility from the community, and also the community is informed and engaged. So part of this is not how do we get everyone, and it'd be great if we could, but if we could get some solid representation from the community there, that would go a long way. I do want to respond to the caller's points in terms of military voters, because this is actually something that I've worked on. When I was in the Obama administration, we worked on this. Military voters face special challenges, especially when they're deployed overseas, because when they request an absentee ballot, often getting that request back takes time. The ballot or registering in the first place takes time. Getting an absentee ballot overseas and back in time for an election takes time. And so there's something called UOCAVA, which is a federal law, and there's an amendment to it that we actually pushed through called the MOVE Act, which really forces states and localities to accept the ballots of military and overseas voters when they are submitted. That's one thing it does. Another thing it does is it establishes voter registration locations on military bases really around the world. So you can register in whatever state that you're from or locality. You can register to vote wherever you're stationed. And the objective here was, we want to make, or when I was in the Obama administration, we wanted to make voting easy and accessible for everyone. So certainly there are a number of communities, language assistance communities, African American community. We certainly wanted to make it accessible in terms of registering, etc. But we didn't want to leave it there. We thought it was important to include everyone, including military voters.
Okay. 440-2665 or 1-800-940-2240. If you're going to be working the polls on Tuesday, this upcoming Tuesday, give us a call. We'd love to hear what people are telling you on from a grassroots level about voting. 440-2665 or 1-800-940-2240. Chauncey joins us from Hampton. Hi, Chauncey. You're on the air.
Hello. How are you doing?
Doing good.
Chauncey. I had a couple of comments. I guess they're more historical. And hello, Eric. This is Chauncey.
Yes.
Your one-time best friend. I think I'm falling out of grace in that category now. But
Never that. Good to hear your voice.
I wanted to make a comment relative to your saying that we need to be more mobile and mobilized and educated in on the front end when bills and whatever are being formed.
Right.
Historically, I believe it was in the late 70s or early 80s, some of what you talked about was realized in the Richmond area, and it led, at least in part, to the election of Doug Wilder, who was the first black governor, I think, in the country. And they formed what was known as the Richmond Crusade for Voters. And even in Hampton, we followed suit and formed the Hampton Crusade for Voters, and which helped to elect Bobby Scott, Mary Christian, and others. I think now we've kind of fallen off some of that. Now I think that we've got it made syndrome kind of crept in, and folks don't see the urgency for that. But these organizations did exactly what you were.
Okay, I think we lost Chauncey, but you've picked up his point.
Yeah. Actually, thank you so much for that call. Actually, it goes right into the next question I wanted to discuss with Spencer as it relates to grassroots versus special interests, okay, in educating the public. Spencer, you mentioned these the Dog and Pony Show as it relates to the ads that are on television and so forth. And we also talked about educating the public on the ground, getting these representatives, these connectors engaged. Now, obviously, these are millions of dollars that go into these advertisements. But the caller just talked about the powerful movement of grassroots and how that movement in Richmond elected Douglas Wilder, the first African-American governor after Reconstruction.
Okay.
Historical
I
point.
want to make that.
P.B.S.
Make that
Pinchback
point.
was the first
Exactly.
African-American governor in Louisiana, during Reconstruction. After Reconstruction, Doug Wilder here in Virginia. So electing him and then others. What's your take on grassroots, the power of grassroots versus the power of special interests?
That's a great question.
It is a great question. It's a great question. And, I really think that we need to invest in the grassroots piece. I think that everyone has a role. And one concern I would have is that, let's just say a big company, they've got some priorities, and they're trying to push those priorities, and that's understandable, et cetera. But I think, for example, the African-American community has some priorities, and we really need to push those priorities, and we need to use various tools to do it. Part of it is the organizational tools that Chauncey talked about, which are critical. Another part of it, though, is, we had a number of African-American fundraisers that I worked with on the Obama campaign and, getting them engaged in terms of, raising money for strong candidates. And then there are obviously people who are at places like Hampton University who are into policy and thinking through issues. So I guess my point is, there's really a role for a variety of different types of people in terms of, advancing the interests of the African-American community, which, frankly, I think benefits everyone when we talk about, workforce training and education and, improvements in terms of the criminal justice system.
Right.
I think those are all policies that benefit everyone. And so I really think that it's not either or, but both and in terms of utilizing different, segments of our community to really make some significant contributions.
When back in the civil rights days, the church was so critical in terms of getting out information, in terms of explaining things and getting people involved. I'm asking both of you, what happened? Because I don't hear people in, within the church settings, particularly pastors, talking a lot about politics from the pulpit anymore, not like it used to be during the civil rights time.
Sure. Spencer, if I could talk about this for a quick second from a historical perspective in public policy. When we look at public policy controlling behavior and resources and then beliefs, African Americans historically have been not put into the arena of being able to access economic upward mobility. So the church was really the first and still, for the most part, the major, if I can use the word, corporation that the African American community has had, for hundreds of years. All right. So within the church, you've had individuals that had the position of pastor. You also have outreach ministries. And that was a place where individuals could come and actually be someone, be recognized as someone. Whereas when you stepped outside of that church, back into Jim Crow, back into separate but equal, you were then marginalized. So therefore, the church had a major responsibility not to just give you the spiritual food, but also to give you the natural food, also to give you the political food, also to give you the social events and the like. So now where African Americans have the ability to be more upward mobile because of the ability to operate within the American and the world system. For the most part, the church has lost some of that steam because of the economic factors.
Mm-hmm. And Spencer, you want to weigh in?
I agree. I would think that in addition to doing things like restoring and holding up church networks, faith leaders, I think they definitely demand and deserve respect, and we need to hold that up. I think we need to kind of look toward the future as well in terms of tools. And so, we see a lot of mobilizing that's being done now online. We talk about Black Lives Matter, and I know that there's a kind of perception that Black Lives Matter is less interested in policy change and or traditional politics because there's a certain distrust for conventional politicians. But I do think that there's some opportunities moving forward with regard to technology and organizing that, we really have to look forward to and take advantage of in terms of bringing people together.
Our phones are lit up. Jean joins us from Hampton. Hi, Jean. You're on the air.
Hi. How are you?
Okay.
Good. My name is Jean Gills. I'm from Hampton, Virginia, and so good to hear Dr. Claville's voice, Mr. Spencer, and you as well.
Thank you.
My concern is that, and I'd like to add to and help promote the senior citizen community.
Oh, wow.
When, just a little brief, my son was 10 years old, and he ran in the house. He was excited because he said Bobby Scott was out in the community shaking everybody's hand. What happened to that door-to-door relationship? Wow. And we're speaking about getting people, the African-American community, to come out and vote more. Well, they don't have that door-to-door anymore. Now, the senior citizen, to speak on behalf of them, especially I work a lot in my community, people have a need to want to feel important and needed. A lot of senior citizens out here that are not voting, and they can raise that 20 or 30% ratio if it's been made to feel a need that they are important too. Wow. So the politicians need to reach that senior citizen community as well. They are very important. Being in colleges, the college kids from ages 18 to 50, they need to be made very aware that it's important that they need to vote, yes. And they do need to be educated. And I thank you for Dr. Claville being a part of Hampton University to try to instill in these people, young people, that it's important for them to vote. But the politicians really do need to get more actively involved in that door-to-door communication, too. And maybe the people will say, well, I will vote, even though they're the only one in the district running.
Gotcha.
They need to get out there and say, and vote. One thing my mother told me, and excuse me, that if I didn't know who to vote for, just go to the polls and vote Democratic all the way. Sometimes I don't even know who I'm voting for, but I do try to do my active part.
Thank you,
and
Jean.
Black communities need to vote.
Okay, thank you so much for your calls and your comments. And go ahead, Spencer.
I'm sorry, Barbara. I just want to kind of build on the caller's comments. Number one, I want to say something that's really important. Which is the caller mentioned Bobby Scott. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I just have to take a minute and say this. Bobby Scott is just really, you all should know, he has just been an outstanding representative here. And I say this
and
not just
everywhere.
because, but he is very community oriented. Yes. Here in Washington, D.C., huge pieces of legislation, the Voting Rights Act and the update, criminal justice, he's completely all over. Right now, he's a ranking member of education and workforce. So these issues that are key, number one, he's into them. Number two, he's like the smartest, person in terms of the members of Congress. I know he is all over these issues. I have events here with scholars here at GW, and I bring scholars. He comes over and really engages with the scholars. If there's something he doesn't know, he asks a question and he gets educated. Just very thoughtful, very committed to community, not transactional at all, just really just outstanding. And so I'm sorry, I can't be on this show without communicating to you all just the respect that he has in terms of, people who are here, but just also how he's committed to policy and committed to community.
Well, Jean brought up another point, too, that I want you all to address. And she said her mother told her to vote Democrat. Our community is always accused, if you will, or expected to always vote for one party.
Right.
And it used to be the Republican Party. Now it's the Democratic Party. But it's almost as if we're a monolith, a block, and we can't think for ourselves. Where do you weigh on that?
Well, no, I don't think that's the case, because the assessment that I give individuals when they make that statement is that you have to look at it from a historical perspective. African Americans as a group of people were subjected to the similar law, similar treatment across the country. Okay, so therefore, when you're subjected to a certain type of lifestyle or restriction of lifestyle, you then start to determine. You develop certain types of beliefs. So then you have parties that are attracted to that. Now, as the African American community are able to do other things and transition into other parts of society, then you'll get a change in ideology, and from this region, that person. However, the African American experience that I've seen during my lifetime has been very similar, whether it be California, Texas, New York, Chicago, Florida. So therefore, you have a similar type of belief.
So when people vote, they really should vote their conscience. They should vote the person that they feel will address the issues that they're concerned about. Go ahead, Spencer.
So
it all depends, right?
So let's kind of take a step back here, and let's say that communities need to focus on their interests. So not a particular party, but really what their interests are. And, just frankly, African Americans really need people who are in both parties, no matter who is in power. People of color, African Americans in particular, need to be at the table. If you look at AIPAC, right, which is they focus on American Israeli issues here. They've got people and members who are very active in the Democratic Party and in the Republican Party, and as a result, both Democrats and Republicans, many of them are very, very pro-Israel, right? And African Americans really need, strong voices across the board in terms of positions of power. Now, that said, in the last election, about 90% of African Americans voted for President Obama. Romney only got 83% of his voters were white. 83% of people of color voted for Obama. Okay. 17% of people of color voted for Romney. So he only got 17% of the person of color vote. I would argue that the way forward for Republicans, frankly, is really engaging candidates like Marco Rubio or people like J.C. Watts who can talk to minority audiences. Sometimes you have people like Clarence Thomas might be one example, although he might not be. I just use him, just how people think of him. Is somebody who's kind of maybe uncomfortable talking to African Americans or might be a little condescending a little bit in terms of at odds. I think you really need to have somebody who is kind of not uncomfortable or not perceived at least as uncomfortable and can really articulate the party's position in a way that's very consistent with the interests of the community. And I think that's, frankly, in light of demographic changes, it's got to be the way forward in terms of the Republican Party, in terms of, reaching out to voters of color, engaging them, but also having significant candidates of color so that they can signal to, all voters that, they really want to compete for folks of color, voters of color.
We've got about 3 minutes left or a little less, but I'm going to try to get one more call in. Mark joins us from Norfolk. Hi, Mark. Your question quickly, please.
Yeah, so I just want to comment. You talked about the black church's apathy as far as, the civil rights. Just want to say one of the big things that I didn't hear anyone mention is the tax-exempt status and the IRS laws that prohibit the leadership of churches to endorse specifically any candidate. And I think that tax-exempt status has kind of really been the 800-pound gorilla in the room where a lot of the pastors have basically pulled back quite a bit in lieu of being afraid of losing their tax-exempt status.
Okay. I'm sorry, I hate to cut you off, but I want to get their response before we absolutely run out of time. This hour has gone by so quickly. So, Eric.
Well, there are ways to get around that. It all depends on who you put in your pulpit. You don't have to endorse them, but of course that speaks volumes. But we're also talking about movements, pastors actually stepping out and church leaders stepping out and actually walking and going door to door with that customer service. And I just 5 seconds. Spencer, I agree with you. Congressman Scott, in my opinion, he is the model of what a congressman should be.
Absolutely, because he is everywhere.
Everywhere.
Okay, so in the last 2 minutes that we have to talk, Spencer, I'm going to give you the first opportunity. Convince our audience, everyone in my audience, but particularly people of color, why November 3rd is critical to them and they need to go out and vote.
Voting is critical because, we talk a lot about our forefathers and mothers and people who died for the right to vote, and that's important. But we also have to think about the future and our kids. And, voting is incredibly important for them. Politicians are afraid of about one thing, and that's losing.
That's right.
And that's voters, right? And if people stay home, they got nothing to fear. They do whatever they want. They don't have to be responsive. They don't have to do what you want.
Absolutely.
If you go vote, they have to be responsive.
Thank you so much. That's Spencer Overton. He is professor of law and president of the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies at the George Washington School of Law. Spencer, thank you so very much for being with us. We appreciate you.
Thank you, Spencer.
Thank you, and Eric. I appreciate you, Barbara.
Thank you. And Eric, 20 seconds.
20 seconds. Again, what makes this country great? One man, one vote. One man, one vote. Grassroots versus special interests doesn't stand a chance. It's all about grassroots, door-to-door, personal relationship, and you can make it happen.
Our very first Claville Report, Policy, Law, and Politics. This is Assistant Professor and Director of the Hampton University Pre-Law Institute, Eric Claville. Thank you so very much.
Thank you, Barbara.
For being with me today. I really appreciate that. And Eric will be on every fifth Friday,
yes.
So we'll be talking about policy and how laws are made and so forth, upcoming in other shows. Fantastic.
It'll be great.
So that's our show for today. If you'd like to hear it again or share it with a friend, please visit our website, anotherviewradio.org, and download the podcast. You can also watch the show on YouTube. And don't forget, you can always stream us live on our website. We're on Facebook, and I'm on Twitter at Barbara Hamm Lee. Next week, we continue our Race Let's Talk About It initiative. We're going to discuss the controversial subject of white privilege. We're calling it Privilege, Power, and Difference. And we would also like you to remind you that our next town hall is on November the 19th here at WHRO. We need you to go to whro.org/talkaboutrace in order to register, because we have very limited space here, so we need you to register. Thanks so much. Our theme music was composed and performed by Jay Sennett. Lisa Godley is our show producer. Victor Bowen is our audio engineer, and Jillian Bullock answered our phones. A very special birthday shout out to my dear friend at NRHA, Diane Montgomery. Make it a great weekend, everyone, and let's get together again next Friday at noon for another view.